All right, good evening. Good to see everyone out this evening. Few announcements before we get started. Of course, Tim is out of town, so let's keep him in our prayers. I don't see Bernice here. I know she's was sick Sunday, so she's still out sick. So let's keep her in our prayers. Um, Baby Watch 2020. No Baby Dasher yet, so they are. Kayla, to her credit, is still working. More power to her, but I think she's pretty worn out in the evening. So Dustin texted me today and said they were going to be home tonight, and he's like, I can't leave her at home by herself just in case. And I was like, well, yeah, I hope you wouldn't. So no baby yet, but who knows? We got an hour till services are over, so anything can happen. Is there anything else I'm missing before Brian leads us in our opening prayer? Tony? Okay, so Tony's having a procedure tomorrow. Studying tonight for his procedure tomorrow. Okay. So let's remember him in our prayers. So Brian, if you would lead us in our opening prayer, please.
Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day that you've given us, that we can come out of the world and be able to come to this place and to study from your word. We pray, Father, that the things that we said, we might be able to glean those truths that you have us to. But help us, Father, to make application of those truths, that we might live in such a way that we please before you. Please forgive us of anything we may have said or done, that we might be able to focus upon the things that will be said. Pray, Father, that you be with those of our number that are not with us, especially with Taylor. That you be with her and pray that things will go well with the birth of a new child. Pray, Father, that you be with each and every one of us, and also be mindful of Tony as he embarks upon a procedure tomorrow, that things will go well for him as well. There are others that are in our midst that we overlook. We pray that you would be with them and watch over them and grant them another opportunity to be with us at the next appointed time. These things we offer up in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so we are on page 40, and we started on this last Wednesday, and we read the first three paragraphs, but didn't get a lot of time to dive into it. So as a refresher, Mark, if you would, page 40 there, if you would, the zeal must be exercised in spiritual battles. If you would just read those first three paragraphs for us, please.
I'd love to, but I don't have
Okay. Sandy, do you have yours? Page 40, those first three paragraphs there under zeal must be exercised in spiritual battles.
Zeal must be exercised in spiritual battles. Most biblical zeal is complete without addressing the issue of violence. Many Old Testament people are described as zealous because they killed the sinful enemies of God. Christians must examine these passages with wisdom to understand their proper application. Sadly, some people act without wisdom and foolishly commit acts of violence today. News stories about violence against abortionists, rapists, and homosexuals are common. These random acts of violence are wrong, sinful, and certainly not the results of Christ-like zeal or heavenly wisdom. When Old Testament heroes killed the sinful enemies of God, they didn't do this as self-appointed executioners. Their actions were in the context of their official government roles. They didn't act as outraged citizens, but as properly authorized and appointed agents of the state. Samson was a judge, David was a commander in Saul's army, Phineas was a priest. Over and over, the Old Testament shows us zealous people who operated within the limits of their God-given roles. Perhaps the best example of this fact comes from the life of King Jehu in 2 Kings 10:16-30. Verse 16 specifically introduces this section by saying, he said, "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." So he made him ride in his chariot.
Okay, thank you. So, talking about this for a minute, there are a lot of examples of, it's talking about you can't talk about biblical zeal without talking about violence. And this is where a lot of people get hung up on, it mentions today, for instance, you see acts of violence against abortionists, rapists, homosexuals. you see these things there. It says they're common. I would disagree. I wouldn't say, they're common in some countries, but here I wouldn't say it's a super common occurrence. But there are instances of those things out there. Now, obviously, all of those things just mentioned there, based on the Bible, we don't believe in those things. We don't support those things, but we don't act out violently against it. That kind of contradicts what you see in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a very violent time period. When you look at, what was God's command going into Canaan? Utterly destroy everybody. Every man, woman, child, beast, everything. And so I think sometimes we read that and we don't think about what that actually means. That's a violent thing that he had them do, and there are people that struggle with the fact that God had people do that. But you also have to keep in mind the Old Testament, different law than what we're under today. Today's law is more about loving. We hate the sin, but not the sinner, and that type of thing. So, just before we get too deep into this, what are some other examples of some of the violence we see in the Old Testament that was used? Some other examples we see. Do you have something, Nancy?
Well, it was like when they were told not to intermarry, but they were having relations. I mean, Rampant and God was getting ready to, destroy him. And Phineas came up and he ran a spear through the adulterer and the Jewish man,
Mm-hmm.
killed them both. But that was approved because it was stopping and showing that this is how bad it is.
Right. It mentions here Samson. What are some of the conquests of Samson? What are some of the things he did? Oh, killed, definitely. I mean,
Philistines, he killed how many of that one?
yeah. I mean, you think what was his weapon of choice? He was known for jawbone. So I mean, he killed. I forget how many. It's hundreds of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. He tied. You read about him tying foxtails together. I've always wondered, how did somebody catch 40 foxes to tie their tails together and put basically a flame in between them to burn all the fields? Like, you look at all the different things that he did. Killed a lion with his bare hands. Probably do what? Right. Yeah. When he died in the end, it's like, okay, I'm going to take everybody else with me as well. I think my personal favorite, one of my favorite stories from the Old Testament, is the story of Ehud. Anybody remember who Ehud was and what he did? So if you read the passage about him and what he did, I remember we studied it in the teenage class, and I said, and they didn't really recall who he was. So we read the whole thing, and I told them going into this, I'm like, Ehud was James Bond before James Bond was James Bond. Like, this whole thing, he went on to basically sneak into the palace, trap the king, kill the king, escape out a window. Like, it's a very interesting story to read. And as we read that, we have to keep in mind these are real people doing real things. Now, obviously, he had God on his side as he did that, but throughout the whole Old Testament, there's a consistent history of violence. Was that okay? So that's the thing people struggle with. So was that violence in the Old Testament, the things we're talking about, was all of that okay? If so, why? If not, why not? Some of it was. So what was the differentiator? God. Exactly. So when you read of the things like Gideon and the 300 men and what they did, Ehud, Samson wasn't entirely carrying out God's will every time he did something. Now, there were times that he was, but not every time. So throughout the whole thing, we see the consistent pattern that made it okay, and the difference was it was God that was giving them a command to do this. Mark?
I was going to say, well, and there's also the rest of the story when it comes to those nations, because they had earned that themselves. They had rejected any sense of of God, and they, the Jews didn't live in a vacuum. People knew who God was. They knew, they would have known or could have known the things that, the things that he approved of and disapproved of, and the offering of your children to, like I just read in the movie, of passing through the fire of your children, offering them as a sacrifice to some idol, and that kind of stuff. And then, of course, if you read a little bit later, even with the Romans and the Greeks, common thread between all of those nations in their decline was their just absolute debauchery that they gave themselves over to. And, God is the ruler. And if you push him to a point where the hammer falls, well, then the hammer falls and you're done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big things you have to keep in mind about today and back then is when God commanded an act of violence against a person or against a nation, what state was that person or that nation in, to Mark's point? They were in a state of sin. They were in a state of evil. So that was their judgment then. But today, are there evil people out there? Oh, without a doubt. But is it our job and our duty to go out there and render judgment on all those people? No, it's not. They'll get their judgment in the end. Jeremy?
Even then, it was different, but not as different as it often looks to us from the way that it is now. It wouldn't have been okay for any random Israelite to just go off to some other nation and assume that, well, because this person doesn't worship the Lord my God, I can just go ahead and murder him and then go back home and everything's fine between me and the Lord. It doesn't work that way. Now, when God had passed judgment on a nation and sent the Israelites to go and destroy them as a result, well, that's just what it is. That's a judgment being passed.
Yeah.
But that wasn't to say that they had the authority to commit acts of violence on a person-by-person basis because they saw sin being committed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent point. So, bottom line, it all boils down to it was God's authority. Misty?
When you look at the Old Testament and New Testament, there's not a huge difference in the law. What Jeremy's saying is very true. The consequences in the Old Testament were a lot more immediate than in the New Testament. Because we're not commanded to go out and stone an adulterer like they were in the Old Testament. God's going to say that destruction for judgment. So I do think that's a huge difference as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So it mentions here in the third paragraph, it talks about King Jehu in 2 Kings. So we're not going to read, it's a pretty lengthy reading, so we're not going to read the whole thing. Somebody walk me through the cliff notes of what happened here with Jehu. I'll give you a hint. If you look in the next paragraph, it'll give you a little bit of what transpired. Jeremy?
Talking just the prophets of Baal?
Yeah.
Okay, so the background that's necessary is that God had appointed Jehu, or he had Jehu anointed by Elisha's not the actual one who did it, but one of Elisha's servants essentially anoints Jehu to be the next king over the northern kingdom, and that includes a mandate for him to go and completely destroy Ahab and all of his descendants. There's not recorded a very clear mandate for him to go and kill all the prophets of Baal, but that's kind of understood.
Right.
Elijah, not too long before that, a generation before, had been involved in doing pretty much the same thing with God's very obvious approval and participation. So Jehu feels like he's got that mandate, and he tricks all of them. He says, let's get all the prophets of Baal together, and we'll have essentially a great celebration and worship, but make sure that none of those Yahweh worshipers come in. And so that's kind of his way of dividing the sheep from the goats. And once all these prophets of Baal come in, thinking they're in friendly company, he closes them in and has them all executed, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a couple lessons ago about Joash, and he kind of did some of the same stuff Joash. I think it was,
Joash or Josiah?
Josiah. Thank you. Knew it started with a J. That Josiah, he kind of did this same type of thing. And then here, to Jeremy's point, he saved himself a lot of trouble in terms of traveling and finding these people and tracking them down. He said, hey, let's have basically a big worship service. Everybody come here. Make sure the followers of God stay out, and let's bring all the Baal, because they're not allowed in this. We don't like them because they don't worship Baal. And then he basically killed them all. Destroyed the high places. It even made mention, and this kind of stuck out to me, that he was obviously very zealous in his act, even going so far as to turn the house of Baal into a latrine. So if you don't know what a latrine is, it's a bathroom. So that's how zealous he was. Like, there's not going to be anything we read of Josiah that, what did he do with the high places and the altars? Come on, guys. It wasn't that long ago.
He destroyed them.
Huh?
He destroyed them and got rid of all the evidence of them.
So much so, he ground them up into powder and scattered them into the water so that it left no place for them to be able to go and remember what this was, or where this place, this thing's final resting place, like utterly destroyed. And it's the same thing here. Hey, we're just gonna get rid of this house so much we're gonna make it a restroom. That's basically the same principle that he did here. So in terms of what he was doing for God, to Jeremy's point, it's implied that he's acting on God's will in doing this, and completely destroyed everything.
It's worth adding on that note. Not only is it implied, I should have included this earlier, that it's explicitly mandated in the law,
right,
that if somebody draws you away from the Lord to worship idols, then this is the treatment you give them, essentially.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, Nancy, if you would, go ahead and read the next 3 paragraphs for us, please.
The chapter continues by describing how Jehu executed or had executed all the Baal worshippers remaining in Israel. Verse 19 even records the undercover tactics he employed to set this every trap. But this passage does not teach Christians to be so violent or to lie. This passage is the record of how God used lawful government bodies and representatives to bring about justice. 1 Kings 19, 16 through 17 specifically points out that Jehu was appointed by God for this very task. Jehu was not acting based only on what was in his heart, but what was commanded from the heart of God. The Lord said to Jehu, because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and had done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. 2 Kings 10:30. And Christians must understand that any physical punishment God desires to bring on sinners today will come through the appropriate and authorized agents of the government. God still uses police officers, judges, prison employees, lawyers, congressmen, soldiers, and secret intelligence operatives to catch, sentence, and execute evil people. You may even choose a career in one of these fields to protect and serve your fellow citizens. What you must not do is foolishly ignore God's authority by acting out violently. For more details on God's use of governments to punish wickedness, see Romans 13.
Okay, so we could spend the rest of tonight and most, if not all, of tomorrow discussing what he just talked about here. And you want to talk about opening a can of worms? That's what he just did. Now, we're not going to dive super deep into this tonight because that's not what this study is about. But he talks here about Christians understanding physical punishment acted out by the government. Now, you could talk about the death penalty, corporal punishment. We could spend, like I said, a lot of time talking about that. That's not what we're here to discuss. Now, God puts those we know that God, we're to respect the government, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God, and we're to follow their order, follow their rule, and they're put there for a reason. And that's not to say, and I don't really necessarily like all of his wording here, the way he says it, but we've talked many times about how sin can have consequences. And, you could go get drunk, have a wreck on the way home, and die. Or you could kill someone else and then spend years in prison. That doesn't mean that if someone's doing something wrong and something like this happens that, that was God's punishment on them. We know God's punishment comes on Judgment Day. But what it does mean is there are sins. There can be consequences to that sin. If I go pull a gun on somebody and they shoot me, did God destine for that to happen? No. But there are still consequences to the actions that we take. And when we get into things like this, it gets hairy. People want to shy away from it and don't want to talk about it. We could talk about going to jail, but when we talk about a consequence possibly being death, it's a little like, well, I don't know. It tends to be a little more hands off. So I hope I don't regret asking this. Anybody, any comments on that before we move on? Okay. So again, I don't want to get bogged down in that, but we talked about the Old Testament and the way that God enacted his justice. And are there people today that argue the Old Testament as still relevant? Yes. So somebody give me some examples that we might even see creep into our congregation here, possibly, if we're not careful. Think a little non-deeper of like killing people, but what are some things that we do see where people use Old Testament to justify the things they do today? Mallory?
Well, I was just going to say, people still use the saying, an eye for an eye.
Okay, we're still thinking violence, but you're exactly right.
It doesn't have to be violent. Like they stole my things, I'm going to go steal their things. It doesn't have to be violent.
Right.
It's petty things. Like people, you look at toddlers. I mean, they're as like as it comes. So like, hey, he took my toy. I'm going to go take their toy. Like the concept carries throughout. The concept that we have.
Misty?
I think religiously you see a lot of people use their right to worship on a Saturday or to have instrumental music based on what they saw in the Old Testament.
Eye for eye, Saturday, worship, instrumental music.
You could add priesthood with that.
Priesthood. I don't think that's right. It's I before E except after C, but I don't think that's right.
Polygamy.
Polygamy. Polygamy, okay. Bringing Utah into it. What else?
You gotta think about how many different people and places post the Ten Commandments every day.
Okay. Ten Commandments, what's wrong with that?
I mean, that's old law. Like, we don't recognize the Sabbath anymore.
Okay. So that kind of ties back into Saturday worship. Like, the Ten Commandments, for the most part, are still ring true today, except for the Sabbath day. So these are all things that, and I'm going to put this one up here. Sacrifices. So these are all things that, you're not going to see a lot of New Testament Christians or Christians, people that profess to be Christians in this country, going out and doing the things that we've been talking about here. But what you will see is, this. You'll see instrumental music, a big one, Saturday worship. You're not really going to see any sacrifices. So we know there's a distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The problem that comes in today when somebody wants to use the argument for, let's take this one right here. I think this one's probably the one we run into the most, instrumental music. If somebody, I think David is one they always bring up. What does it say about David in his heart? He played it, and how was it to the Lord? It's pleasing. It was pleasing to the Lord. So people love to hang their hat on that. What's the problem with using that argument? Somebody said something.
That was on the Old Testament side. That was commanded.
Okay. Mark?
It's a failure to rightly divide the word. I think that's what that rightly dividing is all about. Separating the old from the new. Because there are Hebrews, you can read, there are several books in the New Testament plainly make the case. That is not something, that's not something that we would observe as we New Testament Christians. And we have to separate the two, the practices.
So you mentioned rightly dividing. So let's hang on to that phrase for a minute. So how somebody that uses that argument for instrumental music, what makes instrumental music stand out from everything else on this list? So if we're using the Old Testament and the fact that it was pleasing to God in the Old Testament to justify, well, that's okay to bring that over here. Well, was Saturday worship pleasing to God in the Old Testament? Yes. Were sacrifices pleasing to God in the Old Testament? Yes. How many times do we read, a sweet, savory aroma that it was to how pleasing it was to God? Pretty much, I would say polygamy wasn't pleasing to God in the Old Testament. But, most of these eye for an eye. This was the law that was set out. You had the right to claim what was yours, the royal priesthood. All of these things were pleasing. 10 Commandments, everything. We'll take this one off of here, but everything else up here was pleasing to God. So what is the split? What's the divide that makes this okay, but I don't have to go kill a lamb or a dove? And I'm thankful when you read Leviticus, it gets pretty hairy with what sin requires, what sacrifice, and what bird and what animal. I'm thankful we don't have to do that today. So when you look at this, we have to be careful when you use the Old Testament as an argument. It's a non-factor, because if you're going to say, well, it's okay to do this, then you better still be making your sacrifices and all of that as well. Mark?
Well, all that falls under the law. Because Paul plainly said, if you seek to be justified by the law, you will fall into grace. And that's all I know.
Mm-hmm. Logan?
Yeah, just to go along with that, I think it's important to understand the role the Old Testament played, and that there are a lot of kind of physical things that are just shown as an example to us, so that it's more tangible for us. I can't see through you, but if you look, at sacrifices, we are to live our lives as a sacrifice. The law is now written on our hearts. The priesthood, we're the priesthood. Our time for worship, an eye for an eye, kind of to have the attitude of, to turn the other cheek. There's New Testament equivalents to all these things that are deeper. That was the plan all along.
So you can look at, I didn't say this. You can look at sacrifices. Why don't we do sacrifice anymore? Because there was one. That was Jesus. That's all we needed. Who was also the great high priest, who brought the new law, which changed the 10 Commandments. And, we don't worship on Saturday, but we're still given a set day to worship, which is what? The first day of the week. So when you look at all of these, they weren't just for nothing. They served a purpose, which was leading up to, and that's, I feel like I've said this a lot as I've taught, is I would dare to say it's impossible to understand the New Testament and what it truly means to be a Christian if you don't know the old law. We know it was put there for our learning, but when you read of the symbolism of Christ as the sacrificial lamb and in all these different things you read of in the New Testament, royal priesthood, all of that, if you don't know the Old Testament, where's all that? It couldn't make sense. So it's put there for our learning, not for our justification of, well, I like the way a piano sounds, or I like the way a guitar sounds. That's not what it's there for. And we can't separate out, well, I like this from the Old Testament, but I don't really want to make a sacrifice, or I don't want God to command me to wipe out a nation, so I'm going to keep this but not this. Misty and then Mark.
Paul even said in Colossians that the old law is done away. And I don't remember if it was Paul or the writer, but one of them just said the same thing that you did, was that if you're going to keep a piece of the old law, you have to keep all of the old law. So it's all the sacrifices, it's all the punishments, it's all that detail that you'd have to keep, not just pick and choose what you want to bring forward.
Mm-hmm. And the other fact remains, show of hands. Who likes music? All right, I don't see a single hand not up. So, did God like music in the Old Testament? Does God like music now? But does he like the same type of music? He doesn't like the instrumental music. So, if you're doing this, you're sinning. You're going against what he wants. He doesn't want sacrifices anymore the way it was in the Old Testament. So if you say, a lot of people argue that, well, this just makes my worship that much better. Well, no, he doesn't want this. So if I don't want something, and somebody does it anyways, is that a good thing? Is that going to make me happy? No, if I tell Sawyer, hey, I don't want you to do this, and he does it anyways, it's not the right thing. It's not going to be pleasing to me. Nancy?
Well, in the old law, when they set it up, it was the Levitical, it was the Levites that were playing the music, and they had the chorus, and they were specific on who, that they would lead the music. But when it came, and a lot of it had to do with because of the sacrifices that they needed that music. But then when Jesus came, they didn't even mention anything about playing instruments at all throughout the whole thing. And they would talk about where they sang songs and hymns, but nothing else.
Yeah. All right. Anything else on that? Good discussion there. Logan?
Just another quick example that came to mind. That
Let me get out of your way.
Eliza is tithing, in a lot of these bigger congregations too, kind of where they mandate tithing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's another good one. Jeremy?
In referring to a lot of things like this, and he has something more specific in mind, but it applies to all this. Paul says in Colossians 2:17, these are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. And if we think about the Old Testament in those terms, there's a huge amount of value. Like you said, you can't really understand the New Testament without the Old, but you have to understand that the Old is the shadow and that the new is the substance.
Absolutely. So, very good discussion there. I appreciate that from everybody. I know it's a heady subject, and I know some of the things we talk about directly speak out against things that people in this very town are doing, but it's important to establish that God had a set pattern, just like he did in the Old Testament. And yes, while we're not going to carry out the judgment like Jehu did, that judgment will be carried out one day. All right, page 41. Where do we get to read, Mallory? If you would read the first paragraph, Dan the second, and Fletcher or Jenna, either one, the third there, please.
Once you clearly understand that fighting a good fight, once you understand that Christian zeal is not exercised in self-directed violence, it becomes very easy to see the correct application of zeal in spiritual battles. In Ephesians 6:12-13, things are taught. Our struggle is not against the flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of wickedness, to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel. As a zealous Christian, your efforts should focus on spreading the good news about Jesus Christ, edifying fellow saints, and showing God's love to those in need. Your battles to promote righteousness and oppose sin are not physical, but take place within the heart of God.
Precisely the approach Jesus demonstrated for his disciples to imitate. Peter turned to a sword. Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Pilate questioned Jesus about the nature of his kingdom. Jesus answered, "The kingdom is not of this world. The kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighters, but I will not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm."
With wisdom, Christians can see that zeal is not exercised in physical battles but spiritual ones. None of that Old Testament example of government servants distract you from the solid teachings of Jesus Christ. God is perfectly capable of using the government to punish wickedness in this lifetime. He wants saints to keep the focus on spiritual matters that only wise and loving God can avoid. We must fight the good fights, love, because lost souls need wise, zealous Christians. Chapter 19, chapter 51.
Okay. So as we read through that, we know, and it's kind of rehashing what we've already talked about, Jesus' kingdom isn't of this world. So when Peter's ready to take up the sword to further his cause, it's like, hey, this isn't a worldly kingdom. This is a heavenly kingdom. And so we have to keep that in mind today. We've talked about there are people out there that will commit acts of violence against in the name of Christianity and in the name of God. And unfortunately, it's been that way all through history. But it doesn't make it right. And not only does it not make it right, but Jesus speaks out against it. So we talk oftentimes about, hey, inviting people to church and with gospel meetings, vacation Bible schools, you hear, hey, let's bring friends. That doesn't give me the authority to take a gun and go round up a bunch of people and bring them through the door and like, hey, go get everybody I brought. No, that's not the way to go about it. And this last paragraph here, the sentence here, you must fight the good fight with love because lost souls need wise and zealous Christians seeking them out. Does it remind anybody of a parable? So it reminded me of the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost sheep. They knew there was this lost coin and there was this lost sheep out there, and they went and they sought it out. They went to bring it back to the fold. That's the approach that we're to take in terms of seeking and saving the lost. It's not a violent approach. What do you read about with the reaction to the lost sheep and the reaction to the lost coin? What was their feeling towards that?
They were worried that they were gone. It was lost. And everything that they could, the woman, she got the house. And the shepherd went looking until he found that sheep and went back to his door.
So I would classify it as, there's a loving nature towards wanting to find this, wanting to bring it back into the fold. You work that hard for something, you care deeply about it. That's the attitude that we should have towards the lost today, not a feeling of violence of, well, they're a sinner, so, I feel violent towards them. It's a loving, they're a sinner, I want them to be saved. I want to be in heaven with them one day. That's the attitude we should have. And that's some of the contrast we see between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because it all goes back to God's judgment. It's not physical on this earth like we see it enacted many times in the Old Testament. It's going to be a judgment in the end. So, Jenna, if you would read the bottom line right there, please.
Christians must keep their zeal operating within God's guidelines for physical and spiritual catastrophes that accompany creation. Zeal fuels the admiration and exercise moral adoration by spiritual God.
Okay. So, flipping over to the next page, looking at the questions, page 42. Read Acts 19:23 through 31 about the uproar in Ephesus. What wise principles do you recognize that can help Christians respond with wisdom? We're not going to go read that. Hopefully you've already answered the question. So what wise principles can you see about the reaction to the uproar in Ephesus that can be used?
Nothing good ever comes from rioting.
Very good. Nothing good ever comes from rioting unless you're looking for a new TV or stereo system.
I just kept thinking of never follow a crowd to do evil.
Yeah, never follow a crowd to do evil. What else? Okay, be calm. I found it interesting to to Trey's point there, verse 32 of Acts 19 says, let me find it here. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Like that's to me, that's hilarious. Like, there were people there that didn't even know what they were there for. Like, there's this riot, and there's a particular phrase, and I don't know if anybody think of what I'm thinking of, that goes hand in hand with that. It's a what mentality? A mob mentality. You get strength in numbers. You get everybody together. And we're angry. What are we angry about? I don't know, but I just know we're angry. And so it shows how ludicrous the whole thing is that they're going through, that you've got people there that they're just there to be there. They just want to be part of the group. They don't even really know what they're there for. Mallory?
Well, I mean, how many times have you watched, we were at Fall Festival last October, and we walked past this ridiculously long line, and the joke is, how many people even know what they're in line for? Do you even know what you're in line, and you see all those pictures where people are standing what they think in line, and it's actually behind a bunch of mannequins. So if you don't think for yourself, you're gonna get yourself caught up in, it could be harmless stuff, it could be, a big thing like this. You're not always being aware of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's where some of these things that we talked about, instrumental music, Saturday, some of these things come into play. Is there's that mentality of, well, there's more people out there that use instrumental music than don't. Let's be honest. But just because there's strength in numbers doesn't make it okay. And I'm reminded when I was in 4th grade, I had a teacher that gave us all a worksheet, and she told the whole class, read the whole worksheet and then do everything on it. Well, I'm reading through this worksheet, and as I'm getting through it, I notice everybody around me, like, they're standing up in their chair saying things. They're following the instructions on this worksheet. Well, I didn't want to be perceived as a slow reader in the class, so I just kind of started doing everything too. Out of the whole class, I think it was like 21 or 22 people, one person did what was supposed to be done on the worksheet. And that was, if you read the whole thing, I think I see some people whispering, you get to the end and it says don't do anything on this worksheet. And it was that mob mentality of, well, I don't want to be the one left out, even though I don't really know what we're doing here, and ultimately fail. We don't want to be caught up in that with some of these things. We know, you had people there that didn't know what they were there for. That's not an excuse. And that's where it's on us. We can't say one day to God, well, I didn't know any better. It's each man, each woman, each person's responsible for their own salvation, because we have this. Misty?
I thought it was interesting that none of the ones that were identified as Christians are part of this problem. We don't read anything about them reacting once this mob starts. And then I thought it was even more interesting that the town clerk says, you've got courts and you've got judges and lawyers. Why are you creating a mob? Why aren't you going through the legal system?
Yeah.
So I think that's 2 valuable lessons for us.
Absolutely. All right, question 2 here. Read Romans 10, 1 through 3. What wise actions can you take to extend the message of salvation to people today who have a zeal for God but are lacking essential knowledge? So what are some things you can do for people that have that zeal but don't have that knowledge? Amy?
One thing that's required a lot of times is patience. I know, for example, my mom is not a Christian, but she has a great zeal for God. And so I can't just throw everything at her at once and be like, hey, this is wrong, you have to do this, because that's going to push her away. But conversations developed over time, hopefully she'll start listening.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think patience is a good one. I think throwing out scripture. We know everything we depend on depends on the scripture. So having to have that conversation that this is the basis of everything. All right, question 3, real quick. Nehemiah knew he had to confront the rich and powerful nobles in Jerusalem. It might have been tempting for him to look the other way and avoid upsetting those influential leaders. However, the Bible teaches that Christians are not to compromise their integrity with such partiality. In what situations do you find it tempting to look the other way? I think a big one's with the wealthy. You see a lot of times people with the rich, and I think it was Chuck talked about one time. He had a conversation with somebody about he had another preacher tell him, you got to be careful about preaching things that are going to step on the toes of the richer people of the congregation. That's a terrible mentality. Terrible mentality to have. Final question real quick. Consider the modern problems listed on 41. What other problems would you add? Which of these issues do you have the greatest burning desire to fight against? Anything? One I put that's a hot topic is, and always has been, always will be, is disrespect to the government. You know, it doesn't matter who's in office. There are going to be those out there that aren't happy about it. And it's something that we as Christians have to look out that we don't do. And another one, you know, there's not a lot to add to that list I put was bullying. You know, that's a pretty big one today that you see and something to look out for. All right, lesson 9 next week. Also, if there's anyone else that would like to teach, let me know. Dustin's going to be out for a while, so if anybody else would like to teach, please let me know.
It's good to see everyone this evening. I found out I was singing songs about 2 minutes ago, so appreciate your patience with me. We're going to be singing, that's not the right song. I'll give you the number here in just a second. Number 655 will be the song of invitation. There's a fountain free, number 655. And now we'll be singing number 297. Number 297. Let's sing. I want to be a worker for the Lord. I want to love and trust His holy word. I want to sing and pray and be busy every day in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray, I will labor every day in the vineyard of the Lord. I want to be a worker every day. I want to lead the erring in the way that leads to heaven above, where all is peace and love in the kingdom of the Lord. I will work, I will pray in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray, I will labor every day in the vineyard of the Lord. I want to be a worker strong and brave. I want to trust in Jesus' power to save. That those will truly come shall find a happy home in the kingdom of the Lord. I will work, I will pray in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray, I will labor every day in the vineyard of the Lord.
Tonight I will be talking a little bit about Alexander the Great and where to store our treasure. Alexander the Great was a king of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedonia. He had created one of the largest empires of the ancient world, was undefeated in battle, and is widely considered as one of history's most successful military commanders. Prior to his death, Alexander the Great gave detailed instructions for his burial. He wanted to be buried with his hands empty, uncovered, and protruding through the casket. By doing this, he would let the world know he was leaving nothing behind. The earthly king that had conquered the world was leaving the world empty-handed. An interesting thought for those that are tempted to give material possessions the top priority in their lives. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7, Paul writes, "For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." Throughout history, we have witnessed folks trying to take their possessions with them after they pass away. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs would be buried with their earthly possessions. If you Google person buried with their car, you will find several stories of people being buried in their cars because they believe they could take their vehicles with them after they pass on. However, we know that they could not take their earthly treasures with them when they died, neither can we. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 through 21, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moss and vermin destroy, and where thieves break and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moss and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break and steal. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Christians do not take their treasures with them after they die. They send their treasure ahead while they are still living. Do not be like Alexander the Great and leave empty-handed. Do as God commands in His Word and store up your treasure in heaven. If there is anything that we can do to prevent you from leaving empty-handed, let us know and we will help.
There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste, oh haste to its brink. 'Tis a fount of love from the source above, and He bids us all freely drink.
Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a living stream with a crystal gleam from the throne of life. Now it flows. While the waters roll, let the weary soul hear the call that forth freely goes. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a rock that's cleft and no soul is left that may not its pure water share. 'Tis for you and me, and its stream I see. Let us hasten joyfully there. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. Thank Fletcher for his lesson, and thank Matt for class. It's certainly good to be out this evening. Is there any other announcements that need to be made in addition to what's already been mentioned?
We'll be leaving tomorrow and be gone until Monday.
Okay, so the Middlebrooks, Dan.
Work Sunday, coming weekends, and meeting Sunday afternoon, singing service.
Okay. So singing service at 4 o'clock, and then for the men, we'll be having our meeting an hour before that at 3. Anything else? If not, I'm going to ask Mark if he would lead our minds in a closing word of prayer. Let's bow.
Father, we humble ourselves before you, thanking you for this time we've had, Father, this day to come together. To open our minds, open your word, study it, and talk about it, and try to learn, Father, the things that you would have us to know in this life. Father, we are mindful of the debt that we owe for debt of gratitude to you for Jesus and his willingness to be that perfect sacrifice. He offered once that we can put on him in baptism and become one of your children. And then, Father, if we fail in some way, that he sets at your right hand and he is our advocate. And we are so thankful for that, Father, in our case, as we repent of our sins. We're so grateful, Father, for the church and for its perfect design, which you have created from the foundations of the earth, and how it's perfectly suitable for us and helping us to find our way. We pray, Father, as we leave this place, we might be mindful of those who are trapped, those who are dealing with sickness. Pray, Father, for the young families in the congregation, the children. We pray, Father, that we might always try to be a good example before them. That we might do all that we can to help them grow and to learn. Father, it's our heartfelt desire that so many desire to be Christians like you. Father, as we depart this place, we ask you to please watch over us, keep us safe, give us a pleasant rest, and allow us to open our eyes into a new day. We ask this in Jesus' name.
somewhere to